There's a difference between thinking and thinking clearly. Most of the time, you don't notice the difference. The thoughts arrive, you evaluate them, you act on them, and the quality of the thinking is something you only assess in retrospect, when the decision has played out and you can look back at the chain of reasoning that produced it. But there are moments, specific, high-pressure, money-on-the-line moments, when the difference between thinking and thinking clearly becomes the most important thing in the room. When you can feel, in real time, that something about the way your mind is working has changed, that the thoughts are still coming, fast, fluent, seemingly coherent, but that they're coming from somewhere different than usual, from a place that's more urgent, more defensive, more committed to a specific outcome than to an honest assessment of the situation. You're still thinking. You're just not thinking clearly. Every trader knows this moment, not from reading about it, from living it, from sitting in front of a position that's moving the wrong way with real dollars on the line and trying to reason through what to do, while the part of your mind that's supposed to be reasoning is operating under conditions it was never designed for. The question that Jesse Livermore spent his career trying to answer, not in theory, not in the calm of a classroom or a trading book, but in the heat of live markets with everything on the line, was the question nobody else was asking. Not what to do when the market is against you, how to think. Those are different questions. The first has rules for an answer. The second requires something deeper, a specific quality of mental engagement that doesn't arrive automatically, that has to be cultivated deliberately. And that is harder to maintain than any technical discipline in trading. Livermore found that quality, described it, built it into the structure of how he operated, lost it periodically, as anyone does, and paid the price each time it went, but found it again, kept coming back to it, because he understood that in trading, the quality of your thinking under adverse conditions is not a soft skill sitting on top of a harder technical foundation. It is the foundation. Everything else, every rule, every framework, every piece of methodology depends on it. Without it, the rules don't help. Without it, the framework is just words. Without it, the tape tells you what you need to hear, and you still can't receive it. This is what he figured out about how to think when the market is against you. Start with what happens to thinking when the market moves against you. Not what you've already heard about the neuroscience or the emotional stages, but the specific, granular, moment-to-moment experience of trying to reason clearly when the conditions are actively working against clear reasoning. So the thoughts speed up. That's the first thing most traders notice. The mind starts moving faster, generating more scenarios, more interpretations, more possible explanations for what's happening. It feels like heightened analytical engagement, like the mind is rising to the challenge, like thinking harder is the appropriate response to a harder situation. It isn't. The speed is not a sign of better thinking. It's a sign of threat-activated reactivity. The mind under threat generates more thoughts, not better ones. The volume goes up, the signal-to-noise ratio goes down. The second thing that happens is that the thoughts become circular. You find yourself returning to the same considerations, the original thesis, the original reasons for the trade, the things that made the setup look strong. Not because new information has emerged that makes them relevant again, but because the mind is looking for a way out of the discomfort of uncertainty, and the familiar territory of the original analysis feels like solid ground. You circle, and each circuit of the familiar territory feels like re-examination but isn't. It's the mind seeking reassurance from its own prior conclusions, using the past analysis to avoid the present information. The third thing, and this one is subtle enough that most traders never fully recognize it while it's happening, is that the thinking becomes outcome-oriented rather than information-oriented. The question the mind is trying to answer shifts below awareness, from what is the market telling me to how do I get out of this situation. Those sound similar. They are completely different. Information-oriented thinking is open. It receives whatever the tape is communicating and evaluates it without a preferred conclusion. The answer could be anything: hold, exit, reverse, wait. And the thinking is genuinely available to any of those answers depending on what the evidence shows. Outcome-oriented thinking is closed. It has already decided on a preferred outcome, usually the outcome that involves the least pain, the least admission of error, the least disruption to the current position, and is working backward from that outcome to find supporting evidence. The thinking looks like analysis, it generates conclusions, but the conclusions were predetermined. The analysis is construction, not discovery. Livermore identified this shift from information-oriented to outcome-oriented thinking as the central cognitive problem of trading under adverse conditions. And he identified it not as a flaw in the trader's intelligence or discipline, but as a structural feature of how human cognition works when the stakes are high and the ego is on the line. You can't think your way out of outcome-oriented thinking while you're inside it. That's the trap. The more urgently you try to analyze your way to a sound conclusion, the more the urgency itself pushes the thinking further from genuine openness and deeper into the defensive, outcome-serving pattern. Something different is required, something that isn't more thinking. Livermore called it stepping back from the tape. Not metaphorically, literally. There were periods, undocumented, described in his writing, when he would physically leave his office during a difficult trading period, walk away from the ticker, refuse to look at the prices for a specific amount of time, go somewhere quiet and sit with nothing but the original thesis and the question of whether it was still sound. Not the current price, not the current loss. The thesis. Is the underlying reason I entered this trade still valid? Not is it still possible that the trade will work? That question is almost always yes, which makes it useless. The real question, are the specific conditions that justified the trade's probability still present? Is the information that made this a high probability entry still the information available to me? He found that this question, asked in physical distance from the tape in the quiet that distance created, could be answered with a quality of honesty that was unavailable inside the office, in front of the ticker, with the loss showing in real time. The distance didn't change the facts, it changed the access to the facts. It interrupted the circular, outcome-oriented pattern long enough to create space for genuine, information-oriented evaluation. And the answer, when evaluated in that space, was often clear in a way that the in-office analysis never managed to be. Either the conditions that justified the trade were still present, in which case holding was genuinely defensible on the merits, or they weren't, in which case the exit wasn't a defeat. It was a response to a changed situation, a recognition that the trade that was placed was no longer the trade that existed. Livermore said the hardest part of developing this practice was accepting that stepping back was not retreat. The culture of trading, especially in his era, when the physical presence on the floor and in the office was the visible sign of engagement, associated stepping back with weakness, with running from the problem, with the failure of nerve that serious traders were supposed to be above. He came to believe the opposite, that stepping back when the thinking was compromised was not weakness, it was the specific kind of discipline that allowed for the quality of thinking the situation actually required. There's a concept that runs through Livermore's framework for thinking under adverse conditions that I want to spend real time on, because it's the one that changed the most about how I think about the relationship between a trader and a trade that's going wrong. He thought about the market's adverse movement as a verdict, not a punishment, not an attack. A verdict. Here's the distinction, and it matters more than it might initially seem. When you think about the market moving against you as a punishment or an attack, as something being done to you, the natural cognitive response is defensive. The thinking organizes itself around resistance, around finding the flaws in the attack, around defending the position against the aggressor. The market becomes an adversary, and adversarial thinking is, by definition, not open to the possibility that the adversary is right. When you think about it as a verdict, as the market delivering its judgment on the thesis you presented, the cognitive frame shifts entirely. A verdict is information. It's the aggregate judgment of every participant in the market, reflecting everything known about the situation, delivered through the only honest medium available: price. You presented a thesis. The market has delivered a verdict on it. The verdict might be wrong. Markets deliver wrong verdicts sometimes, mispricing situations that eventually correct, providing opportunities for the trader who can hold through the period of incorrect pricing with appropriate risk management in place. Wrong verdicts are real. But the default assumption, the starting position before evidence to the contrary is available, should be that the verdict is right. that the aggregate judgment of millions of participants, each acting on their own information and incentives, is more likely to be tracking something real than your individual analysis, is to have caught something the market has missed. This is not a humble admission of inferiority, it's a probabilistic posture. Most of the time, when the market is moving significantly against your thesis, the market knows something. Maybe something you'll be able to identify later, maybe something that's not yet public, maybe a shift in the macro conditions that your analysis hasn't fully incorporated, maybe a technical reality, distribution patterns, institutional selling that isn't visible in the fundamental picture. The verdict framework doesn't tell you what that something is, but it tells you to treat the adverse movement as information about a something that exists rather than as noise to be analyzed away or error to be weighted out. Practically, this changes the question you ask when the market moves against you. Instead of, why is the market wrong, which is outcome-oriented, adversarial, and almost always produces a self-serving answer, you ask, what might the market know that I don't? That question is genuinely open. It doesn't have a predetermined answer. It invites real consideration of the possibility that the adverse movement is tracking something real, that there is information in the market's behavior that your analysis hasn't incorporated, and that the honest response is to find out what that information is before deciding whether to hold or exit. Livermore asked this question, not every time, not always successfully, but often enough in his best periods that it became a structural part of how he evaluated his own positions when they moved against him. And the answer, the genuine, honestly sought answer, changed the character of his decision-making in those moments. Not by making him more likely to exit every losing trade, by making him more likely to exit the right ones, the ones where the market's adverse verdict was tracking something his analysis had missed, while holding the ones where the verdict was genuinely premature. Now let me take you into a specific moment, a specific trade. Because the framework I've been describing exists for Livermore, not as theory, but as something he had to discover in real time, in real markets, with real money, showing him the difference between getting it right and getting it wrong. The year is 1907. The financial system is under significant stress. Credit conditions are tightening. Speculation has been running at levels that Livermore's tape reading was suggesting were unsustainable. He had built short positions, carefully, incrementally, through the probe and confirm methodology that his best trading always used. The positions were reflecting his read that the market was vulnerable, that the line of least resistance was shifting from up to down in a way the tape was communicating to anyone watching with genuine openness. And then the market bounced. Hard. Not a small recovery, a significant rally that for a few days had every indicator of momentum and conviction that a genuine reversal would have. Livermore was holding significant short exposure into a market that was making him look wrong publicly and expensively. In that moment, in that specific pressured, uncomfortable moment of holding short positions into a strong rally, the cognitive challenge was exactly what we've been discussing. The market was delivering a verdict on his thesis. The verdict for those few days was adverse, and the question was how to think about it. He could have thought about it reactively. The rally is real, the momentum is genuine, my thesis was wrong. Cover the shorts and get out. He could have thought about it defensively. This is temporary. The underlying conditions haven't changed. The rally is noise, hold everything. He did neither of those things. He stepped back, not physically in this case, but mentally, and asked the question the verdict framework requires. What might the market know that I don't? And he examined, honestly, whether the rally was tracking something real in the underlying conditions that his analysis had missed, whether credit conditions had actually eased, whether the over-leverage he'd identified had actually unwound, whether the specific structural vulnerabilities that had made his short thesis sound were still present. They were. The rally was real in price, but not in fundamentals. The conditions that had generated his thesis had not changed. The market's adverse verdict in this case was not tracking new information about the underlying reality. It was tracking the short-term dynamics of a technical bounce in an oversold market. He held, not because the market was wrong, because his honest evaluation of what the market might know, conducted in the verdict framework rather than the defensive framework, showed him that the adverse movement was not incorporating information, that contradicted his thesis. It was incorporating the temporary exhaustion of selling pressure in a market that was fundamentally still headed in the direction his thesis predicted. The panic of 1907 arrived. The market broke sharply and continued lower. His short positions, held through the uncomfortable rally with thinking that was information-oriented rather than outcome-oriented, produced the results that have been part of market history ever since. The framework held the trade, not the conviction, not the stubbornness, the quality of the thinking. I want to address something directly, because there's an obvious objection to everything I've described, an objection that any experienced trader will have formed by this point in the episode. The objection is this: the verdict framework, the stepping back practice, the honest evaluation of what the market might know, these are all things that Livermore also failed to do. We've established in previous episodes that he held losing positions on hope, that he averaged down, that he knew the framework and broke it anyway. So if the framework didn't protect him consistently, if the quality of thinking he's describing was something he lost access to in his worst periods, what use is it? What does it actually give you that the rules alone don't give you? The answer requires a specific kind of honesty about what the framework is and what it isn't. It isn't a guarantee. Livermore never claimed it was. He was too honest and had been too expensive in his education to believe that any framework, however well designed, could guarantee consistent behavior under the full range of conditions that markets create. What it is, what the framework of thinking clearly under adverse conditions actually provides, is something more modest and more real than a guarantee. It provides a standard, a specific, articulable, honestly held standard for the quality of thinking that difficult trading moments require. And a standard, even when it's not always met, does something that no standard does not do. It makes the failure visible. When you have a clear framework for how thinking should work under adverse conditions, when you can name the difference between information-oriented and outcome-oriented thinking, when you know what stepping back is for and what the verdict question is supposed to produce, you can see in retrospect exactly where your thinking went wrong, exactly when it shifted from open evaluation to defensive construction, exactly when the outcome-oriented pattern took over. And that visibility, that specific, honest post hoc identification of where the thinking failed, is what makes the next instance of the same situation slightly more navigable. Not perfectly, not automatically, but incrementally. In the specific way that any skill develops, through practice, through failure, through honest evaluation of the failure, and through slightly better performance in the next iteration. Livermore got better at thinking clearly under adverse conditions across 40 years of practice. Not perfectly better, not linearly better, but the arc of his development, the genuine improvement in the quality of his thinking in difficult moments, visible in the trading record he left behind, was real. The framework was the standard that made the improvement possible, not the guarantee of consistent performance, the standard that made the failures visible and therefore learnable. There's one more thing Livermore developed, something he described in ways that I find more practically useful than almost anything else in his writing, that belongs in this discussion. He called it the quiet conversation with the trade. Not with himself about the trade. With the trade. He treated the open position as something that was communicating, actively in real time, through its behavior, about whether the thesis it was built on remained sound. A trade that is moving in the expected direction, with expected volume patterns, through expected resistance levels, at an expected pace, that trade is communicating confirmation. It's telling you that the thesis is playing out, that the probability is being validated, that patience is the appropriate posture. A trade that is struggling, that is failing to move through levels it should clear easily if the thesis is right, that is showing volume patterns inconsistent with what a genuine move in the predicted direction would look like, that is behaving in ways that deviate from what the setup implied, that trade is communicating something different. It's telling you that something in the thesis is not playing out as expected, that the market's behavior is not consistent with the story you built the position on. The quiet conversation is the practice of genuinely listening to that communication, not waiting for it to say what you want it to say. Actually listening, with the same openness and absence of agenda that you would bring to any information source you trusted. This sounds simple. It requires a specific kind of cognitive discipline that is genuinely difficult to maintain when money is on the line. Because the trade often says things you don't want to hear. It says them without drama, without announcement, through the quiet, persistent, daily accumulation of price action that doesn't quite match what the thesis predicted. And hearing those things, really hearing them rather than filtering them through the outcome-oriented pattern, requires the stepping back practice, the verdict framework, the deliberate interruption of reactive thinking that the whole structure of Livermore's approach is built around. But when it works, when the quiet conversation is genuinely heard, it produces something that no amount of external analysis can replace. It produces an honest answer to the only question that matters about any open position. Is this trade still sound? Not is it still possible? Not is it going to come back? Is the thesis on which this position was built still reflected in what the market is doing right now? When the answer is yes, genuinely, honestly yes, evaluated in the information-oriented framework with the verdict question honestly asked, hold. With patience, with the confidence that comes not from certainty about the outcome, but from clarity about the process. When the answer is no, when the honest evaluation of the trade's behavior shows that the thesis is not playing out, that the market's verdict is incorporating something real that the original analysis missed, exit. Without drama, without the narrative of defeat, without the self-judgment that turning a clear read into an act of character, just exit and listen for the next conversation. The market is always talking. That's the thing Livermore kept coming back to. In his best periods, in the trades that produced the results that made him legendary, the quality of his performance came down to this. He was listening, really listening, with the openness, the absence of agenda, the genuine willingness to receive information that contradicted his preferences, that listening actually requires. In his worst periods, he wasn't listening. He was talking, building cases, constructing defenses, generating the outcome-oriented narrative that kept the position alive, past the point the market's verdict had clearly delivered. The difference between those two modes, listening and talking, receiving and constructing, is not the difference between a smart trader and a stupid one, not the difference between an experienced trader and a novice. It's the difference between a trader who has learned to think clearly under adverse conditions and one who hasn't. And learning it, genuinely learning it, in the way that produces actual behavioral change rather than just intellectual understanding, is the work of a career, not a course, not a framework, not even a very good podcast. A career, in markets, with real money, making real decisions under real pressure, and being honest enough, each time the thinking drifts from listening to talking, to bring it back. Livermore brought it back more times than we can count, and the times he didn't, the times the talking drowned out the listening for too long, cost him in ways that are part of the public record of his life. But the practice was real, the framework was real, and the results it produced when he was in it, when the thinking was clear and the conversation was genuine, and the verdict was being heard rather than argued with. Those results were real too, the most real thing he ever left behind.